All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez. Welcome to the Public Safety Committee for Wednesday, August 28th. I am joined today by my colleagues, Councilmember Mitch O'Farrell and Councilman Joe Buscaino. And we will go ahead and commence with, we have a couple of general public comment cards and multiple item speaker cards. So we will call up first Antonia Ramirez. So you have 2 minutes for your multiple items and 1 minute for general public comment.
Thank you very much. God almighty, this thing is just a pain in the ass. Starting with number 2, ladies and gentlemen, I hope Mr. William Kill, who will be reappointed for the police permit review, will be competent and able and willing and full of life and just love his position. Number 3, ladies and gentlemen, I think accepting any monies for the year 2016 would be outright fraud, waste, and abuse. Why? We have and have had no security since Daryl Gates left the police department. We have had no public safety. We are truly in dire straits. We are gang infested and under siege. So no money should be given to LA or paid for the year 2016 and on, or even after Chief Daryl Gates left. God rest his soul, the man was great. He was an exceptional officer. No problems back then. Now we are smothered with crimes up the yin-yang. God bless Chief Daryl Gates. May he truly rest in peace. No money should be given to any city office or even the police department, because nothing was done after his death and after he left office. Number 4, I don't know what the hell naloxone is, so I'll pass on number 4. And ladies and gentlemen, number 5, with all the Motorola solutions and all the gizmos and gadgets that we have, why are we still having a public safety issue? Why are we under gang siege? Why are we under drug siege? Goddamn, why are we infested with all these criminals, especially in Skid Row, downtown LA, and La Placita? We have heroin, crack addicts, opiate addicts, white trash junkies, Skid Row niggers, Chango Latino gangbangers and wetbacks, pimps, and mentally ill. Why are these gizmos and gadgets that we taxpayers are paying up so much money with, why are they not effective? Are the cops taking off with them or what? Or did Charlie Beck take off with them? And number 6, implementation of security. What security management system is there? We have none. We have great police officers. LAPD is by far better than the sheriff's department, by far. And God bless them, they struggle so damn hard too. It's a goddamn chief, a city attorney, Mike Fior, who doesn't do his goddamn job. He's too busy getting drunk on Mai Tais along with Joe Buscaino. So fuck that. No way, man. God bless our officers. Number 7, goddamn, get all the fucking homeless junkies and put them in jail, because they do torch tents and they start arson fires all over. So get those motherfuckers and put them all in jail. No house for the niggers, the Chango Latino wetbacks.
Thank you so much. Your time has concluded. Thank you so much. We have Wayne Spindler, please. So you have 2 minutes for multiple items and 1 minute for general public comment.
So, yes, for once. 1 and 2, the police permit review panel, absolutely yes. Absolutely. There's not a nicer guy than William Kill. Never threw me out of a meeting, never argues with me. We got Dr. Laura Urezzi and the doctor. That's right. She even brought her law clerks in to look at my public comment and give her law clerks a 411 on what the First Amendment is. Now, with that said, they got this thing around their necks. It's got white hair. It's about 73 years old. It's this anchor around their necks. and a guy is filing restraining orders over shit that's protected speech. Now, we can't have that. So Laura and Kill want to let you know they're not going to continue serving on this capacity unless people can fucking speak at the meetings, because they don't want to get sued. You don't want to get sued over some dumb shit thing like I'm sitting there chairing a meeting and I let some fucking TRO get filed, because then I'm going to be a witness to something, and then I'm going to hear somebody say something, and then something's going to leak, and then like Current Price, it goes to the FBI, and then everything goes to hell. The FBI comes in. God damn, we don't want the FBI coming in Laura's law office and raiding it. No, we don't. Yes? FBI! We don't want that. I don't want to see that happen. Do you? No, I don't want it. Now, in 2005, these lovely men in black came to my office, and here's the good news. They didn't even knock. They said, "Down, Mr. Spindler!" And I threw my ass down. I looked up at the ceiling. I says, Jesus, I'm a sinner. And the next thing I know, they're throwing all my files all over the office. And finally they said, "You're going to tell us where this clown of yours is hiding." And I said, "No, nigga, as I have to protect his privacy." And you know what they said? "We just fucking with you, Wayne. You're the best. Love the FBI. They my friends since 2005 and drew handguns on me. We love each other. So go ahead, fire Mr. T. Fagan. Fuck Mayor Garcetti. He's a fucking faggot." Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next we have, looks like Mr. Herman, 09-50529.
Am I safe? Is it safe in here? So we got 2 new readmission of appointments. And I know, Miss Laura, you're resting very well. She's part of the police permit review panel. And I advised her regarding the guidance on the ADA regulations of non-discrimination on the basis of a disability in state and local government. Following 28 CFR Part 35 APPB at 686/2015, DOJ, law enforcement agencies, and officers are required to make appropriate effort to determine whether perceived strange or disruptive behavior is a result of a disability. And so we find that William Kill and Miss Laura have passed the integrity test. They both meet the objective and subjective standard, and I am in favor of their position and looking forward to our new and renewed contract with them. However, on item number 7, what nigger has done anything right? Retaliatory discrimination of free speech is a challenge. The case under number 12 CV00551 FMO PJWX is the reason behind the risk of wildfires. It's not trespassing. It's not dangerous activity. A homeless person has a right to live until you can provide HHH. Who are you to retaliate? Who are you? Well, I'm here to take the fucking streets back. I'm here to take the fuckers later. I'm here as well to take the fucking streets back again in support of homelessness, to avoid the dangers and activities of fires that you allege these people are producing when it's not in their fault. The city of Los Angeles has become a challenge of retaliatory discrimination on the basis of disabled people, people who have been fired and don't have a job, and people who are living on the street known as homeless people. Now that I got your attention that Mr. Rue, for the record, is in the house, how much better does a nigger want to know about HHH?
Thank you. Your time is up.
My
And
general
we are
public
also-
comment, ma'am.
No, that was your general public comment as well. You had 3 minutes, 2 minutes for multiple item comment cards, and 1 minute for a general public comment. Your time is concluded. Now we have someone who signed up as the Reaper. It's not you. Okay. Okay. I don't see anybody that's responding to the Reaper, so that concludes general public comment and multiple item comment cards. We were joined by our colleague, Councilman David Rue. So colleagues, for items, I'd like to recommend items 1 through 6 be taken on consent. If there are any objection, no objection, that'll be the order. Do you want to read those into the record?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For item number 1, the recommendation is to approve the mayor's reappointment. Item 2, approve the mayor's reappointment. Item 3, approve the recommendations of the city administrative officer. Item 4, accept the donation. Item 5, approve the CAO recommendations. And item 6, approve the CAO recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now that brings us to item 7, please.
Thank you. Item 7 is a communication from the mayor, city attorney report, and ordinance in response to motion Blumenfield-Rodriguez relative to existing measures to address and mitigate the risk of wildfires in the very high hazard severity zone, as well as trespassing and other dangerous activities in the zone, and amending the Los Angeles Municipal Code to allow for personal notice to individuals who are within a portion of the zone. The item was continued from March 27th.
Thank you so much. And colleagues, just as an introduction, please have a seat. Thank you all very much. And I want to thank you all for being here. So just as an introduction, colleagues, I just want to share with you, before us we have consideration of a motion that, again, was introduced by Councilmember Blumenfield and seconded by me on a draft ordinance to close the gap in our fire code, which exists, that currently doesn't allow for us to, well, it requires 600 feet posting for enforcement of trespassing rules. And the implications of that are dire, particularly during high fire severity zones, and more importantly on red flag days. And so it's with that conversation that we are engaged in this, and I want to thank the City Attorney's Office, the Mayor's Office, Recreation and Parks. This has been a conversation that we wanted to have, a comprehensive conversation, not just about the enforcement rules of what we might shift in this conversation, but more importantly, what are the comprehensive efforts that are going to be led in addressing these concerns. And, you know, it's a common sense approach to being able to essentially remove the requirement for that 600-foot posting, which oftentimes we know signs get destroyed, they get removed, and it's not a feasible solution to some of the challenges that we're confronting in some of these sensitive areas that don't provide public access currently. These are areas that are already determined not to be available for public access, and so what we're doing is helping to clarify the rules and create potentially a better solution for enforcement efforts that would be ensued by LAPD and all the variety of enforcement agencies. And so with that introduction, I want to go ahead and allow you all to introduce yourselves so that my colleagues know who all is here.
Sure, good afternoon. I am Assistant City Attorney Julie Raffish, and I prepared the amendments to the ordinances that are presented before you today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the ordinances. I think that Councilmember Rodriguez did an exemplary job of basically indicating what the amendments cover. It used to be the case where The ordinances prohibited physical presence in certain areas within the city's very high fire hazard severity zone, but it did require the posting of signage in order to enforce what in essence has been for quite some time a set of trespass ordinances. And the amendments serve to provide an alternative to the posting of signage and allow for the enforcement entity to provide verbal notice that a person who is present in one of these restricted areas is in fact in violation of the code, offered an opportunity to vacate, certainly voluntarily, and if not, would be subject to citation and or arrest for violating one of these two particular code sections.
Thank you.
Good morning, or good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Commander Don Graham. I'm the LAPD's Homeless Coordinator from the Office of Operations. I can answer any questions you have as to what the police role is going to be. Obviously, this is a criminal ordinance, and so the police department will be the primary enforcement authority in this, working in coordination with the fire department, the Department of Sanitation, and LASA for their outreach to the population that's there.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Brian Buckner, and I'm the Chief of Homelessness Operations and Street Strategies for the Mayor. My plan is just to do a very high-level overview of the report that you have in front of you. But before I get to that, we'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Jimmy Kim. I'm the Superintendent of Recreation and Parks. I'm also here to answer any questions as it relates to the very high fire severity zones as it relates to rec and parks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Patrick Hayton, LEFD. I am the commander for our industrial commercial section, which includes our brush clearance unit. And obviously, I have a pretty huge stake in terms of how this is rolled out, and I'm prepared to answer any questions you may have after the summary is provided.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nathaniel Vergao, and I'm the Director of Access and Engagement at LASA, so I oversee our street outreach teams. I think for LASA, we normally would not support moving homeless individuals, certainly not just for the sake of moving individuals. However, in this case, it is a question of making sure that their lives are protected. And again, I'll be more than willing to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. And colleagues, just again to kind of preface our questions that we might have, we're embarking on, while it feels like a never-ending fire season for us, I know in my district, upon taking office, I had the two back-to-back wildfires, the largest in the city's history. And while it wasn't related to trespassing or encampments in these areas, we recognize that there are inherent threats that we must mitigate, and reflecting and reviewing our process to help assure that we're providing for the safety for all individuals, whether they are trespassing in these restricted areas that are potentially very dangerous given the fire conditions that we're quickly approaching with the heavy rain season. We know that we've got a lot of regrowth that has now just become kindling, and we want to make sure that we're mitigating those risks as best as we possibly can. And with that, I want to thank LASA just in terms of the efforts that I know we've been successful in deploying in my district in some of these very difficult areas that are not always accessible. We've been successful in actually placing many individuals that were deemed in previous respects as service resistant. We've been successful in getting these individuals into permanent supportive housing and connecting them to those critical resources. And so I will be asking you questions about that. But I do, in fact, want to thank you all for the cooperative and collaborative efforts that we've displayed here, because again, it's one thing for us to have this conversation about changing code. It's another thing to talk about the enforcement mechanisms and how we actually approach it thoughtfully, what the impacts are, how we're actually helping to provide services to these individuals that are trespassing, and more importantly, how we're just, leveraging all of the resources possible to make sure that we're just not that we're comprehensively addressing the concerns that we have. And so again, my thanks to all of you for your work and your participation here today. And so I actually want to talk LASA a little bit about the current outreach efforts. I know some of the SPA leads have been, and we'll talk about the Tier 1, Tier 2 efforts, but in terms of what Tier 1 is for the purposes of outreach, can you share what that process entails right now?
Madam Chair, if I may, I'd actually like to start a little bit further back than that, a little more global, and make sure that you all understand the work that LASA has been doing with County OEM over the last almost 2 years now, in terms of working to develop a more comprehensive plan for how county emergency services can be sure to include people experiencing homelessness in their responses to any disaster. We have worked through a number of plans with the county, and there should be that should be made public soon. It's going to the board. I've been promised very soon, and as soon as it is available for public comment, I will be bringing it to the UHRC to bring our partners into that. We've also we're working with the mayor's office to loop in the city's EMD to ensure that we have a comprehensive plan across the county, including the city resources in that plan, and making sure that there's reciprocal relationships in those plans. To your question in terms of proactive work in the fire zones, prior to my tenure at LASA, I actually worked at LA Family Housing in your council district and actually out of your council office. And so, the work that Homeless Services have been doing this goes back a number of years. We were in all of the wash areas then. Our teams, both LA Family Housings and LASA, are in those washes regularly through today. Our goal across the city is to identify where encampments are in these most dangerous areas and do proactive outreach. A number of the encampments are in very difficult to reach areas, so we've been working, the fire department has been doing their windshield surveys throughout the brush areas. That information will be shared through the UHRC, where we are partners and have access to that. We're working on mechanisms across our departments to be able to ensure that outreach can get out to these areas where we might not have normal access due to the rugged terrain, but to ensure that in all of our approaches to the situation, it includes a service component, so that individuals can be offered opportunities for additional services prior to any enforcement. Our goal is proactively to make sure that folks who are living in these areas understand the dangers that they face. As I stated in my first comment, our primary concern are the folks who are living in these areas. Many of them, although they may have cell phones, those phones are not necessarily registered with our emergency response systems. And if there is a fire, whether their living conditions have anything to do with the start of the fire, their lives are the first ones in jeopardy. And so we want to make sure that those folks are aware of the dangers and are given the opportunity to relocate to areas that would be safer for them. So we'll be working proactively with the fire department to identify those encampments that are in the highest risk areas, to be out there. This planning started earlier this year, several months ago, as a matter of fact. For this season, we had a similar plan in place last season. We're refining it each year, and I think we'll be just getting better and better in our response.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to make sure that individual folks knew about the fact that we had been engaged, in some cases very successfully, with our outreach efforts far in advance of this being ever part of our conversation. And I want to thank LASA for that work, because it's an important part of how we're comprehensively addressing the crisis that we're living through and making sure that we are going to permanently put an end to this situation. And so I want to thank you for your efforts and for the cooperation and working with our fire department on that. I know when we first were working on some of these high fire hazard severity zones, that was the work that kind of prefaced this conversation. So I want to thank you for that. In terms of just going to the city attorney's office, what are the current capabilities of the city to enforce in trespassing in these areas? How can an individual tell the difference of these designated areas?
Right. So under the existing ordinance scheme, which is set forth within the fire code, the city's fire code, certain areas are restricted for public access, either because they are not an identified and paved hiking trail, because they're not parts of the populated community, because the Very High Fire Hazard Severity Zone is a very large footprint, and it includes populated areas as well as rural or rugged and unpopulated areas. So up until this point, an individual would know whether or not they were in a restricted area based on the posting of signage. And signage needed to be posted in accordance with the provisions of the code. And an individual in such a restricted area could be cited were the signage posted. However, the reason why the two ordinances exist in the first instance is because of the severe public safety, fire life safety concern of unpermitted individuals in these spaces that are restricted, whether the space is owned or not owned by the City of Los Angeles. What this ordinance does is it simply allows the individual to receive an alternative form of notice, because as with any trespass statute, it's inequitable and unfair to simply cite out of hand an individual for trespassing unless there's reason to believe that they've received adequate notice and certainly an opportunity to leave the restricted space. That's what this ordinance does, is it allows for that notice to be provided verbally or pursuant to posted signage. It actually provides an alternative. Individuals who refuse to leave the space, so it isn't just individuals experiencing homelessness, it's any individual. I think that's a very important point to make, is that while there may be individuals experiencing homelessness who are encamping in these restricted areas, it's quite possible that on any given day, anyone could find themselves in such a space. So this is really designed as a tool for the city to use to keep those areas that have been determined to be restricted due to the need to preserve safety and fire life safety free from anyone. So,
And who would be the enforcing agency for that?
well, as I said, the sections are part of the city's fire code. They're part of the municipal code. And any municipal code section that isn't specifically identified otherwise is generally subject to misdemeanor enforcement, which is usually performed by the Los Angeles Police Department. I do know that the Los Angeles Fire Department has certain enforcement responsibilities, some of which take the form of issuing notices of violations. But in this instance, because the offense at issue is more of a trespass, it will likely be either the Los Angeles Police Department or certain members of the city's Bureau of Sanitation that have limited arrest and enforcement abilities. But I think what's been contemplated is a coordinated effort with LAPD.
Okay. And with, I know in my district, for example, the Hanson Dam area, which is Army Corps property, but managed and regulated by Recreation and Parks, would it also then bestow authority to the rangers for enforcement of that area?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. So our park rangers will also do enforcements within parklands within the very high fire severity zone. Yes.
Okay, terrific. And I want to make sure that I'm not monopolizing. I know my colleagues have questions, but I would like to go over in terms of the process with the rangers and what those notifications have been thus far and what our process is going to look like going forward in terms of noticing how that process is going to look like under these new rules.
So currently, when our park rangers are doing assessments within the very high fire severity zone, not only in Hanson Dam but other areas of the city, the first thing that they would do is identify the encampment. Once they identify the encampment, we send out our assessment team to make sure that it is in fact, there's different categories when we talk about homeless-related service requests. The four categories that we identify service requests are an encampment, that's where people are actually living. We have illegal dumping, bulky item, as well as stored personal property. So if we identify it as either stored personal property or homeless encampment, we will post it with a 2-week notice. And essentially the reason why we give it a 2-week notice is because with LASA goes out and does outreach, and like LA Sanitation is outreach first. So we allow the outreach happened, and then within that 2 weeks, they get a notification to authorize the cleanup, and then we go out and do the cleanup. When they are within the very high severity zone, we try to prioritize it, and we request through LASA to go out to do immediate outreach, so that way we could go and do the cleanups sooner than later. So that's currently what our process is.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Buckner, I'd like to ask you to, and thank you for the report and the work of the UHRC. It's an important part of the process. I know I have my homelessness task force focused on my district, and getting those kind of street-level solutions is important. So if you could please talk about the data and the census of the homeless encampments and the work that's being led through the UHRC.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. So the work of the Unified Homelessness Response Center is data-driven, and that's a key point. So thank you for emphasizing that. And in terms of the location of homeless encampments throughout the very high fire hazard severity zone, there's really 3 primary data sources that we're integrating, along with other information that we're getting from departments that we can map and overlay from those 3 primary sources. The first one is the Los Angeles Fire Department windshield survey, which was just completed in August, and the results, if Chief Hayden is okay, I can announce those and say that the most recent survey identified 47 sites throughout the zone, but that doesn't mean that there are 47 tents or structures or individuals, because they vary in size, and so they don't count the number of specific structures or tents. So all we know at this point is that there are 47 sites. And so that's the primary one. We also incorporate information from Rec and Parks. Any service request that Superintendent Kim just talked about gets mapped onto the lands that are controlled by Rec and Parks. And then we also do the same with sanitation for any MyLA 311 service request or request for a homeless encampment cleanup within the very high fire hazard severity zone. So those are the 3 primary sources. And just in a conversation that we had yesterday at a fire department-led task force, the police department and Commander Graham here committed to using off-road resources from the police department to supplement the work of the fire department, sanitation, and Rec and Parks. And so we're grateful to Chief Moore and to Commander Graham for making that commitment.
Thank you so much. And colleagues, I'd like to, Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everyone, for this report. I just want some clarification on the actual very high hazard severity zone maps in comparison to other maps that exist from the state and then our own city website, which is fire hazard severity zones. I would just like greater clarification as to where exactly the focus is. We're talking so much real estate in total. So is it more of a narrow focus on the areas where wildfires are more likely to break out? Would that include Griffith Park? Would it include areas in Elysian Park as well? I'm not completely clear on that.
So again, good afternoon, Pat Hayden. So as I understand your question, you're asking, it seemed like a 2-part question, the first part being if I could sort of explain what exactly falls under the very high fire hazard severity zone.
Not the description, but just literally the geography.
Yeah, okay, so the geography, most of San Fernando Valley would fall under the very high fire hazard severity zone, obviously. When you look at, as an example, the Sepulveda corridor, most of that area would fall under. A significant portion of Griffith Park falls in that area, and so on. So those maps are established by our CAL FIRE So it's at the state level where those maps are determined. I recently had a conversation with those individuals there as well as with LA County Fire. And collectively with LA County Fire and CAL FIRE, the very high fire hazard severity zones are established. So we can anticipate, just so that you all are aware, in mid-2020, the very high fire hazard severity zone will increase. So we do not, at the local level, have the ability to lessen their recommendations. We can only broaden. So while we are talking today about a certain area, it will increase in the very near future. So with that, the way in which they determine how that particular area is determined has to do with fire science, essentially. They look at a 50-year historical perspective in terms of fires. They look at our current wind sort of and weather patterns that have essentially led towards those that 50-year pattern. And based on the science, they run quite a bit of that through a formula and determine exactly where that very high fire hazard severity zone should be. As you look at it today, it is very all-inclusive. There are 140,000 parcels, private parcels that is, that fall under the very high fire hazard severity zone, and that does not include government parcels. So it's a significant portion. But what I can tell you is that we've had fires in all of those particular areas that have been impacted, and we will continue to have those fires. Another portion that I think you may have been driving towards, and feel free to stop me if you like, would be the idea of resources as it relates to a fire in those areas when we have a homeless encampment that could have potentially either been the cause of that particular fire or individuals that now are subject to an evacuation or rescue. So when you look at the depleted resources in light of how large the zone is, what we could be experiencing with regard to an actual fire and our first responders, both LAPD and LAFD, having to respond to those particular incidences and actually perform evacuation and or rescue, the idea that we have people who have not already been identified that are not in some sort of a defensible space, they're not living in a home, they don't have a 200-foot clearance around them to establish how quickly the fire may in fact impede on their personal safety. This becomes a huge issue for us because we have to then account for those individuals if we don't have this ability to address and remove them from these areas prior to the fire actually breaking out. So essentially, it just becomes too late.
So clearly, Chief, the focus will be on the areas that we know historically are at the greatest risk.
Correct.
Right, because it's just so much. Now, and I won't belabor this any further, and I'll just do some of my own research, but we have the CAL FIRE map as, I think, under the jurisdiction of the actual state fire marshal, and it's the actual very high fire hazard severity zones for the whole state of California with local responsibility involved. And then we have our own fire department, very high fire hazard severity zones as well. So it looks like that's the data that we're looking at in terms of the zones themselves.
Absolutely.
And then, so that's great.
Just to be very clear, so at the state level, they are now going to mandate how large it can be, and we do not have the ability to restrict that mandate.
Right, that's a state law that we are required to abide by. Question about creating the census of individuals. That's probably starting with a priority as well. This is maybe for LAHSA, but you're going to get a real sense of the individuals experiencing homelessness in these initial focus areas. And I just wanted to see if you have a sense of what those numbers are already based on this year's point-in-time homeless count.
I don't have that number at the top of my head.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to, but because I understand a census of those zones will be created as part of this instruction.
So yes, so the first step in that is the windshield survey that the fire department just conducted. We'll be overlaying that data with the information that we have about where we know individuals to be residing, and working with fire and police to get out to the areas where we've not had contact, as well as repeating contact with those individuals that are known to us.
And then lastly, Madam Chair, once we have our focus areas, and we start addressing those areas at greatest risk. What is, and I don't expect the answer here either, but clearly there's going to be an obligation to take a look at belongings and how to deal with the belongings for folks who need to clear out quickly. And then what would be, which I think is in your report, you lead us down the road of what constitutes an emergency situation, which will dictate how nimble we can be in relation to belongings. And then lastly, the City Attorney's Office, what our liability is within that context. So it's really not a question so much as I'm thinking that will be an area that we'll nail down rapidly as we move forward with this very important initiative.
So I can actually address that. So one of the benefits of the UHRC is that all of these departments are physically co-located in one physical space, and they coordinate very closely in exactly the circumstances that you described, Council Member. And so what we have already planned to do is look at, now that we know the number of sites throughout the very high fire hazard severity zone, we're going to keep saying that throughout the hearing.
You say it very well, by the way.
Oh,
Very
well, I've
smooth.
had
Rolls
plenty
off
of
the tongue
practice.
now.
Rolls off the tongue.
It is prioritized out of those 47 sites, and that's includes information from LASA, from the police department, from the fire department, and from sanitation, so that both in the tier 1 days where there is no imminent risk of fire and the tier 2 days where there's either a red flag status day or the fire department augments their operations in anticipation of a red flag status day, that we will look at those 47 sites and prioritize the ones that are the greatest fire risk. And as a part of the broader plan is working with sanitation, much like they did after the Skirball fire, and we plan to go through all of those sites and go through their normal protocol of scheduled posted cleanups. And again, starting with the ones that are the greatest risk and working all the way through the list, and leading with services and outreach from LASA, of course, but with support from all of the city departments.
And let me underscore the importance of once a site is identified, and then the site must be mitigated based on the explanation you're giving now, that there is absolute clear and concise documentation in advance of anything happening. I think it's going to be increasingly important in our entire approach in general.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Buscaino?
Yes, thank you. Madam Chair, thank you for the presentation, and I do want to recognize our chair, Monica and Bob, for taking lead on this alongside Mayor Garcetti, who has been relentless on this type of issue. Obviously, when you have the threat of fires that could potentially be set off by encampments, it's a threat to private property as well as public property. So I have just a couple questions. I know we live in a beast of a city, right? We're just so separated, over 400 square miles. And I appreciate a couple areas are included in CV15, but I just want to know more about the method of deployment in the event, particularly in the tier 2 or tier 3 days. Will deployment be more reactive or proactive? I can see a lot of heavy deployment on the northern end of the district. I'm sorry, the northern end of the city, of course, where you have the need, and righteously so. But we have 2 areas compared to the rest of the city, which means we may not get the adequate resources on the southern tip of the city. How do you respond to that?
So from fire's perspective, first and foremost, what we try and do when we're looking at either a pre-deployed scenario where we do anticipate potentially a red flag day or a day in which we could experience.
So they're going to post up on red flag days at these specific zones, correct?
Right,
Okay.
right. So obviously part of that would be to pre-deploy. Part of that pre-deployment would include holding over shifts and or augmenting resources with firefighters who would otherwise be off for that particular day. So the idea is not to impact the entire city, but to bring firefighters back. And we have various reserve apparatus where we will staff those apparatus to make sure that we achieve full coverage throughout the city, but also in anticipation of a potential fire, we do have those extra resources to address the issue. What we don't have in that equation is the idea that we can actually, in that particular scenario, adequately address rescue issues in areas where we have not already had some sort of a plan for homeless. So for those individuals experiencing homelessness, what's really important is for us to have this very robust plan ahead of time to make sure that we've addressed those issues prior to the augmentation of resources on an extreme weather day.
Understood. Appreciate that. And then I'm happy to hear, Chief, you mentioned that these areas are flexible. We can also add areas. I know there's other parts of the city, including mine, that have a number of canyons that are adjacent to homes. What would be so you would have to deploy CAL FIRE to make an assessment in order for us to add other specific zones?
So once again, I can't really speak to what that zone will look like in mid-2020, but what I can tell you is we do have the ability to broaden it at that point. And what would be important is to understand exactly what went into their equation and their formula. And I've also asked to have another round of discussions with CAL FIRE in LA County to better understand how they arrived at that expansion. And maybe we could use that same fire science to apply that throughout the rest of the city.
Yeah,
that would be number one. Secondly, what we could also do at that point is identify areas within respective council districts where we could, individually identify certain problematic areas like canyons and so forth. We then have 120 days to report back to the city council, actually, from the point where they actually make this information public. It is our charge then to report back to you because we will have to, by ordinance, increase that area.
My experience as a SLO in Harbor, one area that I was actually surprised not to see on there was the Peck Park Canyon. We had ATVs that we use, they still utilize today, and that's something I'd like to direct the fire department to take a look at, that specific area, the canyon directly adjacent to a number of residential units. And then lastly, if I can, Madam Chair, to LAPD, or just in general, maybe the city attorney, I feel that we need to add just a little bit more teeth to this, specifically as it relates to stay-away orders. In our experience in dealing with shelter-resistant individuals, who you can give them warnings, you can tell them to leave an impacted Tier 3 area, you can cite them for trespassing, but you and I know they'll be back there after the Tier 3 and the emergency is all good and fine and it's deemed safe. So I would like to see a little bit more teeth in specific stay-away orders, so we're not, you're not seeing, in my experience as a street cop, and also even more so in visiting some of these encampments, that you tell them to leave, you're trespassing, but they have that mindset they want to be able to get back into these high-impacted areas. So what's your response to that?
Well, council member, I agree. But the propriety of a stay-away order is usually something issued by a court pursuant to some sort of prosecution, right? So the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a viable tool that law enforcement can use in order to effectuate the removal of someone from one of the restricted areas in question. Given the unique...
Will your office proceed with stay-away orders if indeed you're still getting the same individuals who are coming in and out of these high-impact areas?
I would assume, because I don't represent the criminal branch of my office, but I would assume that any prosecution involving trespass almost always includes a request for a stay-away order from the location in question, or the type of location in question. So that would be a stay-away order from any restricted area that is not an inhabited space, a public roadway, or an established hiking trail or campsite. I don't think we have any established campsites within the very high fire hazard severity zone. I don't think so, but that's the verbiage of the existing ordinance, so that's what's utilized. But
yeah, this is concerned. Homeless individuals also can be seen as quote-unquote urban campers in these high fire zones, who actually like that lifestyle, live that lifestyle, but at the same time, they pose a threat to, the city and the surrounding residents. But appreciate that, and I'm hopeful that, as we see this goes through and the enforcement piece moves forward, that we recognize those who don't abide by the trespass order, and those who do get cited, we're not dealing with the revolving door here in these high fire zones. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Buscaino. Mr. Rue.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for championing this issue. And this is something that's very exciting to see, and more particularly the fact that it's a unified vision, especially with LASA on the table, and I'm completely agreeing with this. This is very, very important, especially in light of, I think my colleague here was reminding me, it was some 12 years ago, before my time, when it was the big Griffith Park fire. I mean, the big fire, and I believe it was started by a campfire cooking type start. So this is so very important. But I had a question for the chief. Currently, all the very high fire zones are, they're all in the hillsides for the most part, or hills?
I think generically you could say that that would be the case. I can think of some areas that are not necessarily quote-unquote hillsides that may be right at the edge of the very high fire hazard severity zone. For the most part, I would say that that would be a generic yes.
Okay. And you said in 2020, mid-2020, there could be a possible expansion.
Correct.
And that's because you're going to wait for, I guess, the definitions of, can you repeat that again? You said you're waiting for the definitions from?
So again, CAL FIRE, in conjunction with LA County and LA City, I did have a collective meeting to determine exactly how the very high fire hazard severity zone is currently established and how it will be established in the future, and determined that in 2020 they will be using a 50-year fire model to determine exactly how they will expand the very high fire hazard severity zone. So I asked a very specific question: do you believe you will be expanding the zone? And the answer was, more than likely, it will be expanding.
So CAL FIRE will be expanding it, not
Correct.
the city of LA.
Not the city of LA, no.
Okay.
But to Councilmember Buscaino's point, and I would be willing to look at your specific situation, Councilmember, to determine if we should give some reasonable thought in terms of what needs to happen there. It is important at the local level that we take ownership in terms of what we're looking at and reassess what they have recommended and either broaden or agree with where they are and report back to your council.
Yeah, so I would be also very interested in that, whether we could do it sooner or if we want to wait for CAL FIRE to finish their assessment to see how we could extrapolate from how they assessed high fire zones and see if we could, if it would be beneficial elsewhere in the city. However, of course, then that has other financial funding costs as well. So it's a double-edged sword there. But I think this is a great step for the protection of especially our hillsides and our wildlife like Griffith Park, but also for individuals experiencing homelessness who, when it starts getting cold, just doing what's natural to them could actually endanger themselves. So thank you for this.
Thank you. And sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was just going to circle back to Councilmember Buscaino's question about where resources will be directed throughout the zone on the Tier 2 days. Obviously, in a Tier 3, when there's an emergency, the resources are going to be directed there. But on the days like a red flag status day, what I've learned from my fire department colleagues is that there are microclimates throughout the city. And so even though there's a red flag status day, that doesn't mean that there's an actual elevated fire risk across or throughout the entire zone. So wherever the elevated risk is, our intention with the support of LAPD, LASA, and the fire department is to actually direct resources to every part of the zone that has an elevated risk on that day or those days.
If I can, Madam Chair, so say if we get a complaint, say in Machado Lake, where you have 100 homeless individuals who are camping out. In fact, there was a fire there a few years back that's almost spilled into LA Harbor College. I mean, that's more reactive, correct? I mean, we have to look at ways to be more proactive in get service providers in these entrenched areas with LAPD, ATVs, whatever we ought to do, fire department. I mean, we shouldn't have to wait for a red flag day, right?
Correct. And so we do plan to work with LASA and others to do that regular proactive engagement. And we also know at least I think several days in advance when there's going to be a red flag. So we know to marshal and increase the operational footprint and start going after this so that we don't have to wait for any complaint. But to your point, yes, during the times when there is no elevated risk, we still do have a plan to work through encampments throughout the zone.
Thank you. And actually, just with respect to that part, where I know with Tier 3 situations, it goes into EMD mode where Recreation and Parks takes the lead, opens up a lot of our rec centers for emergency shelters. And so I just wanted to pose the question, has it been considered that even on the potentially when we're talking about the Tier 2 circumstances, that we perhaps utilize that same model for a Homeless Connect Day, or to have more of a comprehensive suite of outreach services that we could actually more thoughtfully and comprehensively engage the populations that we're talking about, because I think that's going to be an important part of this broader conversation, so that we don't have to worry as much about stay-away orders and be more effective at getting many of these individuals connected with the documentation that they need, whatever resources that would better support them not living in these conditions. So I just wanted to leave that with you and ask. I don't know if that's been considered at all, but I really would like to see perhaps Recreation and Parks, or when we go through these Tier 2 scenarios, that we look at rolling that out as well. And with that, I know I also wanted to mention, we did have ample conversations or reference the fact that the resources that are going to be we're talking about requiring additional resources, and I know with our off-road unit, they're oftentimes overtaxed, and looking and reviewing at what the implications are going to be with these additional efforts. I know that we'll have some budgetary implications, I'm guessing, with that. And so there's been a list of additional resources being required of all of the various agencies in the report, and so, but I wanted to know whether or not the departments have looked at their budgets and what the implications are going to be, and prepared any additional asks for budget and finance.
So from the from the PD standpoint, which will be primarily involved in the scouting and confirmation of camps sites during a Tier 1 phase, so that we can confirm information in a non-enforcement posture for our partner agencies to begin the outreach process and identification process. Some of those can be accessed by the current off-road resources that we have now, and so I don't see that as being impacted. And that's just a matter of scheduling, and we will work with Transportation Bureau to make sure that that happens as soon as we get the information from the UHRC. As we move into the potential for a Tier 2 or Tier 3, if you'll allow me to just work backwards, a Tier 3 day, as your colleague could tell you from his street days, that's the day where everybody drops everything they're doing and goes out to the command post. So finding resources on Tier 3 days is not going to be an issue for the police department. It's those Tier 2 days where we look in anticipation of going out and actually doing, the outreach has been done to the point that it can be done at that point, and now we have the danger situation, and enforcement is the mode that we have to shift into. So in looking at our resources across the city, the HOPE teams would be the most logical activation resource for it during the week. But since divisions and fire hazards happen 24/7, we're also bringing to the senior lead officers into that training mode. So we'll be providing the basic training that the fire department is putting together and cross-staffing with our training for the senior lead officers and the HOPE officers around the city as to the particulars of the enforcement of the ordinance and fire safety and danger recognition as they proceed into these very high fire zones. As we've been joking at the table, as we've been working at this is going to be a reversal of fortune, because usually we're providing force protection for the fire department, and now the fire department will be providing force protection for us as we go off into these very high fire zones, because wool burns.
You're welcome.
And we love our brothers and sisters in red for that. So as some of the things that we had put forth to the mayor's office as an augmentation to his note to you, as our contributions to his note to you, we have West Los Angeles Division has a vehicle, an ATV vehicle that seats 6, and one of the logistical issues that had come up is okay, so we go into this enforcement mode and we have people that we need to take into custody. How do we get them out of these hard-to-reach areas? Well, West Los Angeles has had a lot of success with this 6-person vehicle to be able to secure both the police officers, equipment, and suspects, and to extract them from those high brush areas. So if we go forward with this discussion, we already have all of the research that we've done as to what their model is, and we can transmit that to the City Council for consideration. The other thing is that we looked at, is the HOPE team model going to be enough if the Tier 2 day threatens enough real estate in the city? And so when we looked at the fire department's average for red flag days throughout a year was 8. So what we extrapolated out is if we would have a readily trained group of senior lead officers and HOPE officers around the city that are on days off on rotating basis, because we'll be changing our HOPE deployment to meet the care detail. So that the request of overtime monies that would be earmarked specifically for call-up for these trained officers to be able to respond to the UHRC, to a station, to a command post, suit up, and then go out in the field and immediately be force multipliers in that contact scenario. So we would have the HOPE resources, we'd have the SLOW resources, and then that would be our third tier of resource pool, is to tap into this, into an overtime fund if the city decides to go ahead and fund that piece. The other pieces of the budget are just protective equipment for the officers that would respond, that would be stationed at the 14 divisions that have very high fires.
Hazard severity zones.
Yeah, that too. There are 14 divisions across the city that have real estate that fall into one of those identified zones. So having those pre-staged resources at that station would allow for immediate deployment for the safety of the officers that are responding. So that's the encapsulation.
And I appreciate that, but in my limited experience and also knowing with the costs of cleaning and clearing some of the sanitation efforts that we've deployed in some of these areas, I would just expect that there's going to be some impacts of a budgetary matter, and I think it would be very wise to be thoughtful about because again, we can put this on paper, but the reality is that making sure that we are thoughtfully deploying these resources so that we are effectively mitigating these potential threats is important. And so, I mean, that's why we've engaged in such a comprehensive conversation, which I appreciate, but I also recognize that we will have, I'm sure, inherent need to increase the budget for this effort, and with a number of agencies that are going to be deploying additional resources, the off-road unit being one of them. To your point, the one vehicle is one vehicle, but when we talk about a variety of areas, it's not necessarily going to be accessible at times when we need them all at the same time, and we're talking about larger numbers of individuals potentially. So I just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about those conversations and not trying to shortchange ourselves and not being able to adequately deploy the resources that are necessary to do the work that we have to do here in order to mitigate that risk.
So to that note, we asked about looking at the feasibility of purchasing 14 vehicles that can be pre-staged at each one of those divisions that have very high fire severity zones in their real estate pool, so that they can be immediately deployed for to that division to co-locate with fire and then launch into the severity zones and begin that enforcement posture.
Okay. And so we look forward, I'm sure, in the mayor's budget for 2021 for this to probably be an ongoing part of our conversation, because as you mentioned, we're only going to be broadening this map. It's not going to be shrinking, and so this is just going to be another part of the service impacts that we need to consider when we're talking about our budgeting process. So I just want to make sure that that everyone is thoughtful about that part of the conversation. With that, colleagues, were there any additional questions? No? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to recommend the adoption of the motion, receive and file the mayor's report and refer additional resources section to the Budget and Finance Committee for consideration, and adopt the draft ordinance. So if there's no objection, that will be the order. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And with that, I believe we have cleared the desk. Yes, that cleared. Thank you so much. Our meeting is adjourned.